On a bright afternoon, Alan Fisher walked into the Silver Fork, a charming restaurant nestled in the heart of the small town of Willow Creek. Known for its welcoming atmosphere and home-cooked meals, the restaurant had become a local favorite. Families celebrated birthdays there, friends gathered for long chats over coffee, and regulars enjoyed the warmth of a community hub. Alan, a retired Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, looked forward to a quiet lunch in a familiar setting. At 70 years old, Alan carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms. His face, lined with the stories of battles fought and sacrifices made, told of a man who had given much to his country and community. He wore a crisp button-up shirt tucked into neatly pressed slacks. On his head sat his signature red baseball cap, embroidered with bold white letters that read, "Make America Great Again." To Alan, the hat was more than a political slogan. It symbolized values he held dear: freedom, resilience, and pride in his service. It was also a sentimental reminder of his late brother, who had shared the same values and had been an unwavering source of support throughout Alan's life. The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the enticing aroma of freshly prepared dishes. Alan greeted the hostess with a polite smile, and she led him to a table by the window. He sat down, gazing out at the bustling street beyond, a content expression on his face. Moments like these, a simple meal in a familiar place, had become one of the quiet joys of his retirement. But not everyone viewed Alan's presence with the same warmth. Across the room, Patrick Green, the restaurant manager, had noticed the bright red hat as soon as Alan walked through the door. Patrick was a man of strong convictions and a self-declared advocate for inclusivity. To him, the sight of the hat represented division and conflict, and he was determined to maintain what he called a safe space for all patrons. The sight of Alan wearing the hat made Patrick bristle with discomfort, and he decided to take action. Patrick approached Alan's table with quick, purposeful strides, his face set with determination. Alan, who had just opened his menu, looked up as Patrick stopped at the edge of the table. The contrast between the two men was stark, Alan's calm demeanor against Patrick's tense, almost defensive stance. "Sir," Patrick began, his tone sharp and unyielding, "we have a policy against political attire here. I'm afraid I can't serve you while you're wearing that." Alan blinked, surprised but not shaken. His voice was even as he replied, "I'm not here to make a political statement. This hat isn't meant to offend anyone. It's just part of who I am." Patrick crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "I understand that's how you see it, but the hat makes some of our patrons uncomfortable. I'll have to ask you to remove it or leave." Alan's weathered hands rested on the edge of the table. For a moment he considered his options. The clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversations around them seemed to fade as the two men locked eyes. Alan's voice remained steady as he spoke. "I've served this country to defend everyone's freedoms, including yours. But if those are your rules, I'll respect them." He stood, adjusted the hat on his head, and reached for his cane, his movements deliberate and calm. As he walked toward the door, the room seemed to hold its breath. A few patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others averted their eyes. Whispers rippled through the air, some quietly supporting Patrick's decision, others questioning whether it was necessary. Outside, Alan paused on the sidewalk. He took a deep breath, letting the cool afternoon air steady him. Though the encounter had been brief, it left him with a bitter taste of disheartenment. Alan had faced countless challenges in his life, but being judged so quickly over a symbol left him reflective. He straightened his posture, adjusted his jacket, and began the short walk back to his modest home, determined not to let the incident define his day. Back inside the Silver Fork, Patrick returned to his duties with a sense of satisfaction. He believed he had upheld the restaurant's values and set a firm precedent, but he failed to notice the growing tension among the diners. In a corner booth, a teenager discreetly snapped a photo of Patrick addressing Alan, already drafting a post for social media. The caption read, "Just witnessed something crazy at the Silver Fork. A veteran got kicked out for wearing a hat." As Patrick continued his rounds, he noticed some patrons whispering among themselves, their expressions ranging from disapproval to silent agreement. An elderly woman leaned over to her dining companion and murmured, "That man didn't deserve that. You can disagree with someone without humiliating them." Her companion shrugged, glancing at the door Alan had exited through. "Maybe," she replied, her voice uncertain. "But it's Patrick's restaurant. He has the right to make the rules." The ripple effects of the confrontation were already beginning to unfold. The teenager's social media post gained traction, quickly spreading among local circles and beyond. Within hours, it sparked heated debates online about whether personal beliefs and symbols should be grounds for exclusion. Some users commended Patrick for standing by his principles, while others were outraged at what they saw as disrespect toward a veteran. Unaware of the brewing storm, Patrick moved through the rest of his day with a sense of accomplishment. For him, the situation had been resolved, but for Alan, and for the many who would soon hear about the incident, the story was far from over. As Alan walked through his front door later that afternoon, his wife, Eleanor, greeted him with a warm smile. But she quickly noticed the heaviness in his expression. "Something happened at lunch?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. Alan hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his disappointment. "Nothing I can't handle," he said, his voice steady. But Eleanor knew her husband too well to press him further. She simply placed a comforting hand on his arm, her presence a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone. For Alan, the day's events were another reminder of the challenges that came with standing firm in his beliefs. But what he didn't yet know was that his son, Ethan Fisher, a prominent social media figure, would soon take the story into his own hands, igniting a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the walls of the Silver Fork. That evening, Alan Fisher sat at the head of his modest dining table, a warm glow from the chandelier casting soft light over the room. The dinner was simple: a roasted chicken, fresh greens from the local farmer's market, and buttery rolls Eleanor had baked earlier that day. Across from him sat his son, Ethan Fisher, a dynamic 30-something with an infectious energy that often filled the room. Ethan, known for his sharp wit and passionate advocacy on social media, had built a massive following as a voice for fairness and justice. Eleanor poured iced tea into glasses, her gentle presence balancing the energy between her husband and son. As she passed Alan his plate, she noticed his uncharacteristic silence. Alan was rarely one to brood, but tonight, his demeanor was heavier than usual. Ethan noticed it too, his brow furrowing as he set down his fork. "Dad," Ethan began, his tone light but probing, "how was your day? You seem quieter than usual." Alan hesitated, cutting his chicken slowly. "It was fine," he said, his voice measured. Eleanor's eyes flicked to her husband, catching the subtle signs of discomfort. She placed her hand gently over his on the table. "Alan," she said softly, "what happened?" Alan sighed deeply, setting down his fork. "It's not worth making a fuss over," he began, but as he glanced at his son and wife's concerned faces, he relented. "I went to the Silver Fork for lunch today. The manager there asked me to leave because of my hat." Ethan's expression instantly shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "Wait, what?" he asked, sitting up straighter. "He asked you to leave? Because of your hat?" Alan nodded. "He said it made some patrons uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just wanted lunch." But he was firm about it. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes filled with quiet disapproval. "That's just wrong," she murmured. "After everything you've done, for this town, for this country, to be treated like that." Ethan, however, was not as restrained. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "You're a veteran, Dad. You've earned the right to wear whatever you want, wherever you want. Who does this manager think he is?" Alan raised a hand, signaling for calm. Ethan, it's not worth getting worked up over. I've faced worse in my life. This is nothing. But Ethan wasn't convinced. It's not nothing, Dad, he argued, his fists clenched on the table. It's about respect. They humiliated you over a hat. People need to know this kind of behavior isn't okay. Eleanor reached across the table to touch Ethan's hand, her tone soothing. Your father's right. He's dealt with far bigger challenges. Sometimes the best thing to do is let things go. Ethan shook his head, clearly unconvinced. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his mind racing with ideas. While Alan and Eleanor shifted the conversation to other topics, Ethan's thoughts remained on what had happened. He respected his father deeply, but he couldn't fathom how a man who had given so much could accept such treatment with quiet dignity. To Ethan, staying silent felt like complicity. Later that evening, while Alan retired to his favorite armchair with a book and Eleanor tidied the kitchen, Ethan sat at the dining table with his laptop. The more he thought about the incident, the angrier he became. His father's quiet grace only made the situation more unjust in his eyes. Alan had always taught him to stand up for what was right, and Ethan felt a responsibility to act. He opened his video software and began recording. My name is Ethan Fisher, he said, his voice calm but firm, and I want to tell you about what happened to my father today. He paused, holding up a photo of Alan in uniform. This is my dad, Alan Fisher. He's a Vietnam veteran, a man who served 2 tours for this country, and someone who's spent his life giving back to his community. Today, he walked into a local restaurant wearing this hat. Ethan held up Alan's red MAGA hat. And he was told to leave, not because he was causing trouble, but because someone decided that his hat made them uncomfortable. Ethan's voice grew more impassioned as he continued. This isn't just about my dad. It's about every veteran, every individual who's ever been judged for what they wear or what they believe in. My dad fought for freedom, for everyone's freedom, and today he was disrespected for expressing his own. He ended the video with a call to action. If you believe in respect, if you believe in treating people with dignity, share this. Let's make sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unnoticed. Within hours of posting the video to his social media accounts, it began to gain traction. Comments poured in, ranging from messages of support to outrage directed at the Silver Fork. This is unacceptable, one user wrote. How can we let this happen to someone who's done so much for our country? Another commented, Thank you, Ethan, for speaking out. Your dad deserves better. By the next morning, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting clips of Ethan's video alongside photos of Alan in his military uniform. Hashtags like #respect our veterans and #stand for freedom began trending, and the incident became a national topic of discussion. Ethan fielded interview requests from reporters eager to amplify the story, while social media users called for accountability. The Silver Fork found itself at the center of a firestorm. Its social media pages were flooded with negative reviews. I can't support a place that disrespects veterans, one review read. Another warned, this restaurant doesn't deserve my business. The once bustling establishment began to see cancellations and dwindling lunchtime crowds. Outside the restaurant, a small group of protesters gathered, holding signs that read, Honor our veterans and Freedom for all. Inside, Patrick Green was overwhelmed. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, each one another blow to the restaurant's reputation. Employees whispered nervously, their morale plummeting as the backlash grew. Amanda, one of the servers, hesitated before approaching Patrick. Have you seen this? She asked, showing him Ethan's video on her phone. Patrick scowled, frustration etched across his face. Of course I've seen it, he snapped. People are overreacting. We have a right to enforce our policies. Amanda bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. I don't think this is just about the policy, Patrick. People are upset because they think we disrespected a veteran. Maybe we should address it. Patrick waved her off dismissively. We don't need to justify ourselves to the internet. This will blow over. But it didn't. The backlash only intensified. Former employees began to share their own negative experiences working under Patrick, describing a pattern of rigid control and confrontational behavior. Customers recounted similar incidents of Patrick enforcing policies in ways that felt more personal than professional. What had started as a single confrontation was now spiraling into a reckoning for both Patrick Green and the Silver Fork. While Alan Fisher quietly tried to move on, his son's unwavering determination had sparked a movement that would ripple far beyond their small town. As the public outcry over the incident at the Silver Fork grew louder, Patrick Green, the restaurant's manager, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. What he initially dismissed as a minor confrontation had escalated into a nationwide controversy. Ethan Fisher's viral video, which painted a poignant picture of his father Alan's quiet dignity and undeserved humiliation, had sparked an online movement. The Silver Fork, once a beloved gathering place in Willow Creek, was now being viewed as a symbol of intolerance and poor leadership. Negative reviews flooded the restaurant's social media pages and business profiles. Former patrons expressed their outrage, writing scathing comments about Patrick's actions. "How could you treat a veteran this way?" one reviewer demanded. "He fought for our freedoms, and this is the thanks he gets?" Another comment read, "This place doesn't deserve our business." Boycott. The Silver Fork. The backlash wasn't limited to online comments. Cancellations for reservations poured in, and regular customers stopped showing up. Protesters began gathering outside the restaurant, holding signs with messages like, "Respect our veterans," and "End discrimination now." The once busy lunchtime crowds dwindled to a trickle, and the cheerful hum of diners inside the Silver Fork was replaced by an uneasy silence. Inside the restaurant, Patrick felt the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing day. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, most of them articles or comments about the incident. Employees whispered among themselves, their usual camaraderie replaced by tension and uncertainty. Amanda, one of the servers who had worked at the Silver Fork for years, approached Patrick cautiously one afternoon. "Patrick," she began hesitantly, "have you thought about addressing this more directly? People are really upset." Patrick, who had been pacing in the back office, turned to her with frustration written across his face. "I already posted an apology," he snapped. "What more do they want?" Amanda hesitated. "I think people feel the apology wasn't sincere. They want to see action, not just words." Patrick waved her off dismissively. "This will blow over. People are just looking for something to be mad about." But Amanda wasn't convinced, and neither were the rest of the staff. As the days went on, the tension among employees grew. Rumors began to circulate about who might quit next, and shifts became increasingly difficult to manage. The staff's once strong bond was fraying under the pressure of Patrick's dismissive attitude and the constant barrage of criticism from the outside world. The situation worsened when former employees began to speak out on social media. One anonymous post read, "I worked at the Silver Fork for 2 years, and Patrick always pushed his personal views onto the staff. If you didn't agree with him, you were treated like a problem." Another added, "This isn't the first time Patrick has let his biases affect how he runs the place. The environment was toxic, and that's why I left." These posts gained traction quickly, further fueling the public's disdain for Patrick and the restaurant. News outlets picked up on the controversy, framing it not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader critique of Patrick's management style. Local journalists began investigating, uncovering stories from both current and former employees who described a pattern of confrontational behavior and rigid control. One particularly damning article featured an interview with Emily Hayes, a former assistant manager. "I tried to implement changes to make the workplace more inclusive," Emily said, but Patrick dismissed every suggestion as unnecessary or disruptive. He'd say things like, "If you don't like it, you can leave," and many of us did. As these stories spread, the narrative surrounding the Silver Fork shifted. What began as outrage over a veteran being denied service had become a broader condemnation of Patrick's leadership and the toxic culture he had fostered. The once beloved restaurant was now seen as a cautionary tale of how personal biases and poor management could lead to a business's downfall. Even within the restaurant, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Amanda and a few other employees began openly discussing their frustrations during breaks, venting about Patrick's refusal to take meaningful action. "I'm only here because I need the paycheck," Amanda confided to a coworker, "but I don't think this place is going to last much longer." Outside, the protests grew in size and intensity. Local veterans groups organized peaceful demonstrations, drawing attention to the way Alan Fisher had been treated. Veterans in uniform stood side by side with members of the community, holding signs and speaking to reporters about the importance of respecting those who had served. Clips of these protests went viral, adding to the mounting pressure on the Silver Fork. Meanwhile, Patrick's personal life began to unravel. Friends and family distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the scrutiny surrounding him. His younger brother, Ryan, confronted him during a family dinner. "You messed up, Patrick," Ryan said bluntly. "Big time. And the worst part is, you're acting like it's not your fault." The words stung, but Patrick couldn't deny their truth. For the first time, he began to reflect on his actions. Late at night, sitting alone in his office, he scrolled through the endless stream of comments and articles about the incident. One comment in particular struck a chord. "Do you even know what this man has been through? Do you know what he sacrificed for this country?" Patrick leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by a sense of regret he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. He realized that in his effort to uphold what he thought were the restaurant's values, he had failed to consider the person behind the hat. Alan Fisher wasn't just a man wearing a symbol. He was a veteran, a father, and a member of the community. Patrick's assumptions and biases had blinded him to Alan's humanity. Determined to understand more, Patrick began researching Alan's life. He read articles about Alan's service in Vietnam, his commendations for bravery, and his contributions to the community. One profile detailed Alan's work organizing fundraisers for local veterans and mentoring young men and women considering military service. The more Patrick learned, the more ashamed he felt. The image of Alan walking out of the Silver Fork replayed in Patrick's mind, but now it was accompanied by a deep sense of shame. He had dismissed a man who had given so much to others over a personal bias he hadn't even questioned. For the first time, Patrick understood the full weight of his actions. But understanding wasn't enough. Patrick knew he had to take responsibility for what he had done. He needed to make amends, not just to Alan, but to the community and to the staff who had endured the fallout of his decisions. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but Patrick resolved to take the first steps. Patrick Green's awakening wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. The mounting backlash against the Silver Fork, combined with the personal stories he had read about Alan Fisher, forced him to confront the man he had become. For years, Patrick had prided himself on his principles, believing that his firm stance on creating an inclusive environment made him a strong leader. Now, as he scrolled through more articles and comments late into the night, he realized that he had been blinded by his own biases. His rigidity had led to a public humiliation of a man who deserved respect, not rejection. Patrick spent days replaying the incident in his mind. He thought about the way Alan had handled the situation, with quiet dignity, refusing to escalate the confrontation even as Patrick's words cut deeper than he had intended. The shame weighed heavily on him. Alan hadn't shouted or argued. He had simply left. That silence, Patrick now understood, spoke louder than any words could have. Determined to take responsibility, Patrick reached out to Ethan Fisher through a mutual acquaintance. It wasn't an easy decision. Ethan's video had been the catalyst for the firestorm that had engulfed Patrick's life, and Patrick knew the younger man had every reason to dismiss his attempt at reconciliation. But Ethan agreed to meet after Patrick expressed his genuine remorse and his desire to apologize directly to Alan. On a crisp afternoon, Patrick pulled up to Alan Fisher's modest home. The house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and flower beds, exuded warmth and simplicity. Patrick sat in his car for several minutes, rehearsing the apology he had practiced repeatedly in front of his bathroom mirror. Despite all his preparation, his palms were clammy, and his heart raced with anxiety. He finally mustered the courage to step out of the car, his resolve bolstered by the belief that this was the right thing to do. Before Patrick could knock, the door opened. Alan stood there, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. "Mr. Green," Alan said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Come on in." Patrick followed Alan into the living room, his eyes immediately drawn to the framed photos and mementos that adorned the walls. There was a black and white photograph of a young Alan in uniform, standing proudly with his comrades, and a folded American flag encased in glass resting on the mantel. Each object seemed to tell a story, and Patrick felt the weight of his actions even more acutely in the presence of such a life well lived. Alan gestured for Patrick to sit, and he did so, clasping his hands tightly in his lap. "Mr. Fisher," Patrick began, his voice trembling slightly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I needed to come here in person." Alan nodded but said nothing, his expression calm and measured. Patrick took a deep breath and launched into the apology he had spent days crafting. "I want to start by saying I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you that day. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about who you are or what you've done. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I disrespected you in a way that was completely unacceptable." He paused, his throat tightening. "I've spent the past few weeks learning about you, your service, your sacrifices, and the work you've done for this community. The more I learned, the more ashamed I became. You didn't deserve what happened, and I take full responsibility for my actions." Alan studied Patrick for a long moment, his gaze steady. "I appreciate you coming here to say that," he said finally, his voice measured. "But an apology isn't just about words. It's about what you do moving forward." Patrick nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I understand that. I've already started taking steps to educate myself and to create an environment at the Silver Fork that's truly inclusive. I know it won't undo what I did, but I'm determined to do better." Alan leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Green. What matters is whether we learn from them. You've taken the first step by coming here and owning up to what you did. But it's a long road, and actions speak louder than words." Patrick swallowed hard, the sting of Alan's words tempered by the respect he felt for the man sitting across from him. "Thank you, Mr. Fisher," Patrick said earnestly. "I promise I'll do everything I can to earn back the trust I've lost." Alan nodded and extended his hand. Patrick rose to shake it, the gesture feeling far more significant than any handshake he'd ever experienced. "Take care, Mr. Green," Alan said as he walked Patrick to the door. "And remember, treating people with dignity isn't just a nice idea, it's a responsibility." As Patrick stepped outside and walked back to his car, he felt an unexpected mix of emotions. The weight of guilt that had burdened him for weeks was still there, but it was now accompanied by a sense of hope. He had taken the first step toward making amends, but he knew the journey ahead would require much more than an apology. Over the next several weeks, Patrick threw himself into making changes at the Silver Fork. He worked with a diversity and inclusion consultant to implement sensitivity training for his staff, ensuring that every employee understood the importance of treating all patrons with respect. He reached out to local veterans organizations, offering the restaurant as a venue for events and fundraisers. He also began volunteering at community events, hoping to demonstrate his commitment to becoming a better leader and individual. Despite his efforts, Patrick faced resistance from both inside and outside the restaurant. Some staff members, still frustrated by the fallout from the incident, viewed his actions with skepticism. Others had already decided to leave, unwilling to remain in an environment they no longer trusted. Among the community, opinions remained divided. While some acknowledged Patrick's efforts to change, others felt the damage had already been done. Through it all, Patrick remained focused on the lessons he had learned from Alan. He remembered the quiet dignity with which Alan had handled the situation and used it as a guide for his own actions. Patrick knew he couldn't undo the past, but he was determined to take responsibility for it and to create a better future for himself, his staff, and his community. Despite Patrick Green's efforts to rebuild the Silver Fork's reputation, the damage proved to be insurmountable. The restaurant, once a bustling community hub, now sat eerily quiet during peak hours. The dining room that had been filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses was now a shadow of its former self. Regular customers had moved on, and the negative press surrounding the establishment had left a permanent stain on its legacy. Patrick had tried everything he could think of to turn the tide. He worked tirelessly to implement changes, introducing sensitivity training for his staff and partnering with local organizations to host community events. He reached out to veterans groups, offering discounts and special dinners to honor their service. He even made personal appearances at these events, hoping to demonstrate his commitment to change. But no matter how hard he tried, the memory of what had happened to Alan Fisher lingered in the minds of the community. The restaurant's financial troubles became impossible to ignore. Suppliers began hesitating to renew their contracts, wary of being associated with the controversy. Employees who had stayed out of loyalty or necessity began to leave, citing the stress of working in an environment under constant public scrutiny. Amanda, one of the last remaining servers, approached Patrick after a particularly slow day. "Patrick," she said gently, "I've found another job. I'll be putting in my notice." Patrick nodded, his chest tightening. He couldn't blame her, or any of the others who had left. They had endured months of uncertainty and stress, and they deserved better than what he had been able to provide. As Amanda walked away, Patrick stood in the empty dining room, the weight of his failure settling over him. He knew the restaurant's closure was inevitable. The final blow came when the restaurant's landlord informed Patrick that the lease would not be renewed. With no financial cushion to fall back on, Patrick began the somber process of preparing for the Silver Fork's closure. He spent the final days packing up equipment, taking down decorations, and saying goodbye to the place that had been his pride and joy for so many years. The empty walls and bare floors seemed to echo the lessons he had learned, each one a reminder of the mistakes that had led to this moment. But even as the Silver Fork's doors closed for the last time, Patrick's journey was far from over. The experience had fundamentally changed him, forcing him to confront the biases and assumptions that had shaped his actions. He realized that his failure wasn't just about one incident. It was about a pattern of behavior rooted in ego and a lack of empathy. Patrick began attending community workshops on diversity and inclusion, seeking to understand perspectives beyond his own. He listened to veterans share their stories of service and sacrifice, gaining a deeper appreciation for the challenges they faced both during and after their time in the military. One story in particular struck a chord. A veteran described the isolation he had felt upon returning home, unable to find the respect and understanding he had hoped for. Patrick couldn't help but think of Alan Fisher and the quiet dignity with which he had handled his own humiliation. Through these workshops, Patrick began to rebuild his sense of self, not as the manager of a once successful restaurant, but as a man learning to grow and change. He volunteered at local veterans events, often working quietly behind the scenes to set up chairs or serve food. These moments, though small, gave him a sense of purpose and connection. They reminded him that redemption wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistent effort and genuine humility. Alan Fisher, meanwhile, continued to live his life with the same grace and resilience that had defined him for decades. The incident at the Silver Fork became a footnote in his story, a brief interruption in a life dedicated to service and community. When asked about the incident by a local reporter, Allen simply said, "What matters isn't the mistake, it's what you do afterward." Patrick made the choice to grow, and that's something I respect. Ethan Fisher, who had initially viewed Patrick's attempts at redemption with skepticism, began to see the sincerity in his efforts. The two occasionally crossed paths at community events, where Ethan observed Patrick working quietly to support veterans and foster inclusivity. Eventually, Ethan featured Patrick in one of his advocacy videos, highlighting his transformation. "It's not about perfection," Ethan said in the video. "It's about progress." Patrick's story shows that even when we fall short, we can still choose to rise and do better. Patrick's growth extended beyond his personal life. Drawing on his experiences, he began consulting for small businesses, teaching owners and managers how to foster inclusive environments and navigate difficult situations. His workshops, titled Lessons from the Silver Fork, became popular in the local community, offering practical advice and personal anecdotes about the importance of empathy and accountability. The closure of the Silver Fork also sparked broader discussions in Willow Creek. Local leaders organized forums to address issues of inclusion and respect, using the restaurant story as a cautionary tale. Schools and community centers began hosting events to educate people about the impact of biases and the importance of understanding others' perspectives. What had once been a divisive incident became a catalyst for meaningful change. For Patrick, the journey of redemption was ongoing. He often thought back to his meeting with Allen and the quiet wisdom the veteran had imparted. Treating people with dignity isn't just a nice idea, it's a responsibility. Those words became a guiding principle for Patrick, shaping his actions and decisions as he moved forward. Months after the Silver Fork closed, Patrick stood on the stage at a community event honoring local veterans. The room was filled with people of all ages, many of them veterans themselves. Patrick had been invited to speak, and though he was nervous, he felt a sense of purpose as he addressed the crowd. "I thought I knew what leadership was," he began, his voice steady. "I thought it was about standing firm in your beliefs and creating an environment that aligned with your values. But I was wrong. Leadership isn't about control or exclusion. It's about empathy, humility, and the willingness to learn from your mistakes. Alan Fisher taught me that, and I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." As Patrick stepped off the stage, the crowd applauded warmly. Among them was Alan, who offered Patrick a nod of quiet approval. It wasn't a grand moment, but it didn't need to be. For both men, it was enough to know that progress had been made and that change was possible. The story of the Silver Fork, though marked by mistakes and loss, became a powerful testament to the enduring potential for growth and redemption. It reminded the community and the world that even in the face of failure, the choice to do better is always within reach.